Well, for more on humanitarian aid efforts in Syria, I spoke to Samer Abboud. He's an associate professor of historical and political studies at Arcadia University. He explained where the money is going.
We have to distinguish from the very beginning between actual pledges and donations. A lot of people around the world are giving donations to organizations that are working inside of Syria, and these are mostly Syrian-based organizations. The international community, on the other hand, is thus far basically only offering pledges, and when they do donate money, they're giving that money to international organizations, UN programs, the bigger aid agencies, and unfortunately, many of these agencies don't have access to some of the areas that are most in need of humanitarian assistance. So there's a very big disconnect between what's pledged, what's donated, and the accessibility that international agencies that are getting the bulk of the money have in the Syrian context.
And as you mentioned, pledging is just that first step. So when it actually comes to distributing that aid, what are some of the challenges?
The first is finding partners. It's unclear who the transmitters of. Sometimes this ends up going to UN agencies that don't necessarily have the assessment capacity, that is to understand where the aid needs to go, who are the target populations, but more importantly, they don't necessarily have the access, the ability to bring aid in from the outside world into areas. So what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is that first there are huge pledges, and oftentimes this isn't matched in the actual donations, and then the donations are distributed among all these agencies. There's very little coordination, and usually they end up targeting what I would consider to be the kind of more visible areas, and these are not the places that most Syrians need money. Of course, Syrians who are refugees living in Turkey, Syria, Jordan, those countries, they certainly need aid, and they need aid today, tomorrow, and over the long term. Affected areas deep inside of Syria. And for me, the larger question is how can the international community those communities in this humanitarian crisis?
Is there a better strategy, perhaps, that some of these organizations could be using to make sure that it actually reaches those people?
The fundamental problem of aid to reach those invisible populations, in this context right now, a piece of the political is that issue of humanitarian access is at the forefront of these discussions. Honestly, it's not. So despite all the pledges, despite all the donations, and of course the readiness of Syrians and international aid agencies, aid and resources, food, things like that into Syria and into the peripheries, into the refugee areas, it's unfortunately beholden to the violence.
And we're seeing that the global community, governments from across the world, are meeting in London at the moment, and they've pledged about $10 billion through 2020 to help with the Syrian conflict. In your opinion, is that enough?
No, unfortunately, it's not. First of all, the $10 billion that's pledged will likely not materialize. So we're looking, if we're lucky, at half of that.
And why is that?
The second thing, well, I think that the international community has really failed the Syrian people. There's a humanitarian catastrophe that is generational. It will affect not just this Syrian generation, the next Syrian generation. And I think that there's a lot of pressure on member states, on aid agencies to provide the kind of humanitarian relief for Syrians. This is also occurring while there's tremendous pressure within Europe to push back against refugees, to kind of create the conditions to keep refugees in the region. This is very problematic, of course, because refugees are fleeing the conflict, and so the source of the refugee problem is the conflict itself. That said, I think that there's a desire on the part of member states, aid agencies, to look as if they're doing something. So pledging hundreds of millions, billions of dollars certainly satisfies that. They can then turn to their constituencies, they can turn to their ministries, they can turn to the international community and say, look, we're actually trying to do something. The other problem is that the funding comes, at least the pledges, suggest that the funding, half of it will be spent in 1 year, and the remaining figure will be spent over 3 years. Now, this brings us to 2020. And as I said earlier, this is a generational problem. We need commitments from the international community to not only support Syrian relief efforts in the next year or 3 years, but over the next 25 to 30 years.